Hello, my name is Lidia Lae and my co-author is Yoshi Kashima from the University of Melbourne. I'll be presenting on what and how do people share about themselves across cultural narrative study. In the 1980s and 1990s, scholars in psychology started to question whether many of the basic psychological theories like self-esteem and self-concept developed in the West were indeed universal. Questions were asked like, do people think of themselves differently across cultures? If so, how do we measure it? This is the focus of my thesis, a systematic method to investigate cross-cultural differences, particularly in what and how do people share about themselves. To investigate this topic, researchers have increasingly considered Bruner's call back to the importance of narratives. The reason being is that narrative is a medium in which we express ourselves and transmit cultural meaning. It is crucial to our self-concept and identity. Bruner focused on autobiography because it involves not only the construction of self, but also a construction of one's culture, hence the importance of it in psychological research. Autobiography is the written form of self-narrative, and in Bruner's view, it should be at the heart of culture and self-research because he saw life as narrative. Researchers who have used a self-narrative approach in different cultures have found that Westerners like the European Americans and Easterners like the Chinese differed in their self-narrative contents, in that Western self-narratives have self as the central protagonist, while Eastern self-narratives position the self as a bystander in the shadow. In mother and child studies, different narrative discourse styles were identified. Fivush, Wang, and colleagues found that Westerners use an elaborative style of narrative discourse where mothers encourage in their children a detailed unpacking of experiences. On the other hand, Eastern mothers encourage in their children a repetitive style of asking the same questions which requested less description and evaluation from their children. Westerners and Easterners also had differences in memory studies, where Westerners recall more detailed one-time events, but Easterners had routine ones that were succinct. For example, going shopping every Fridays with my family. Now, despite the increase of studies using the self-narrative approach in recent decades, to date, there is still a lack of empirical studies focused on understanding cultural differences in the structure of self-narratives. Because culture is considered a system or repository of meaning, Kashima and Haslam have argued for a hermeneutic, which is an interpretive approach, and experimental semiotics to be incorporated into psychological research programs. Semiotics is an investigation of meaningful symbols and signs. Kashima and colleagues in their papers outline one semiotic approach, that of Greimas' model of narrative structure, as a possible useful framework in analysing self-narratives. So what is Greimas' model? It describes 3 axes and 6 actants. Basically, the subject tries to obtain the object in the axis of desire. But in the quest, there's usually a helper and opponent in the axis of conflict. A moral agent or authority as sender releases the object to the receiver in the axis of communication. Greimas proposed that this structure forms narrative and may be evidence in each of our lives. An important objective of this current research is to investigate whether Greimas' model can be used to understand what and how do individuals share about themselves in their self-narratives, especially in the most studied cultural groups between Westerners and Easterners. To achieve this objective, I conducted 3 studies utilising a mixed method research design, with study 3 being the main study, which I'll focus on later on because it's the culmination of studies 1 and 2. In the first exploratory study, with 6 European Australians and 6 Singaporean Chinese, an adapted version of Mac Adams's life story interview was used. Participants were asked first to share about their open-ended spontaneous life story accounts, and then they were prompted using Greimas' model. For example, to elicit the actant helper, they were asked, was there anyone or anything that helped you achieve the goals or pursuits? If so, who or what? To validate the Greimasian approach, narrative accounts were shown to cohere with those derived from Mac Adams's life story interview. Now, the results and feedback from Study 1 helped to create the online tool in Study 2, which was then piloted with 15 European Australians and 15 Malaysian and Singaporean Chinese. The participants were recruited through the University of Melbourne's Research Experience Program, where they sat through an online questionnaire delivered through Quadrix and computer lab sessions. The online questionnaire, the format of it was similar in both studies 2 and 3. There were 2 sections, section A and B, with section A similar to the one in study 1 with spontaneous and prompted accounts. But what differed was the key events, because study 1 participants shared that they preferred that instead of going through all the different life episodes of Mac Adams's life story account. Now, key events are considered as self-defining memories which comprise autobiographical memory. Hence, in the last part of section A, participants were asked to share about the key events in their lives, up to about 5, with most sharing at least 3, and whether it was a positive or negative event. The trends in the findings of studies 1 and 2 were investigated in study 3 with a larger sample of 120 participants, 60 recruited through the University of Melbourne and 60 from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore by Professor Hong. Due to the time constraints today, I'll only present to you the main findings of study 3. A series of mixed ANOVAs and chi-square tests of independence were conducted for each of the actants. Overall, the results show that Westerners reported more subjects than Easterners. Now, this Venn diagram and the table below shows the frequencies and percentages within each cultural group of each of the thematic categories of subject. For example, self-only was a subject is reported I, me, myself. Self and other was the self, and then including also mother or sister, for example. Others only was that when no self was reported as a subject, but others like family, and unclear was when no subjects were reported. Westerners were more likely to have self as the subject. In fact, wherever self was, it was in Western self narratives. Now, there were more other for Eastern self-narratives, and more Easterners reported unclear subjects. For objects, there was a cultural difference in that Westerners reported more spontaneous self-oriented goals than Easterners. On the other hand, Easterners had reported more unclear or no goals compared to Westerners. In the axis of conflicts, overall, Westerners shared more helpers and opponents than Easterners. Now, this cultural difference may be due to the fact that Westerners have more elaborative self-narratives in that they just share more, but it could also be possibly due to Easterners not being as comfortable sharing about the conflicts in their lives, or having a dialectical self. Easterners tolerate more conflict, and therefore the axis of conflict is de-emphasized for them. Now, further analysis showed that Westerners reported more self as an opponent compared to Easterners. In the axis of communication, Easterners are more likely to report family as a receiver spontaneously compared to Westerners. In comparison, Westerners tended to report self as receiver more than Easterners when prompted. Now, these results raise the possibility of the salience of both object and receiver in defining the subject, and different cultural pathways impacting self-narrating styles, which I'll show next in the heat maps. Now, these heat maps cross-tabulates 2 variables, that of subject and object, displaying their relationships. It uses colours to code the frequencies, with red being the most down to orange, yellow, and dark green being the least. We can see here in the top left table of Westerners spontaneous that 40% of Westerners have self-only subjects and self-only objects of desires as indicated in the deep red. However, when prompted, the distribution changes with more mention of others. Now, this illustrates again that Westerners use an elaborative style of narrative discourse in that they share more once prompted. The results also suggest that Westerners tend to have a decontextualized self. That is, they spontaneously present a self-contained self that is apart from its context. Therefore, I term this way of presenting or talking about the self in Westerners as a decontextualized self-narrating style. Westerners use both an elaborative and decontextualized self-narrating style when they share about the subjects and objects in their self-narratives. Now, this is different to Easterners with different color cells lighting up and similar patterns from spontaneous to prompted. In fact, it's only when prompted that Easterners share more of self in combination with others. But their subject remains more other only from spontaneous to prompted, showing a repetitive style. Therefore, I term this way of presenting or talking about the self in Easterners as a contextualized self-narrating style, because the self is embedded and connected with others in its context. Now, these similar patterns of self-narrating styles are seen here between subject and receiver. These heat maps through attentional analysis provides a way of understanding the processes of building a culturally informed self through various self-narrating styles, which would impact on autobiographical memory. Because what you say about yourself gets stored in memory for the opportunity to share in social situations. What we can conclude is the usefulness of Greimas's model in analysing real-life self-narratives and understanding what cultural differences may be found in the different axes and actants of the narrative structure. For Western self-narratives, self-populated most of the actants and highlights the bounded and self-contained entity of Westerners. Now, this also emphasizes the independent self-construe and that Westerners tend to pursue self-enhancement is captured beautifully by the 20-year-old European Australian female's excerpt, which I'll read out. Learning about myself, what kind of person I want to be, who I want to be friends with, how I want to live my life, what I want to do tomorrow to make myself better. Now, this is in contrast to Eastern self-narratives where other is the focus as the subject. And they featured more family as the receiver, which categorizes the interdependent self-construe, and that Easterners tend to pursue family enhancement as captured beautifully by this 21-year-old Singaporean Chinese female's excerpt, which I'll read to you. It would be about me and my family mainly. I would strive to achieve success because I want my family to live a better life. Now, in terms of how people narrate about themselves in different cultures, the findings conclude that Westerners provided more elaborative, spontaneous and prompted self-narrative accounts. They use what I term a decontextualized self-narrating style of foregrounding the self as a self-contained entity. In contrast, Easterners provided more a repetitive discourse style that did not vary much between spontaneous and prompted accounts. They used what I termed a contextualized self-narrating style of embedding the self with others in its context. This research advances our knowledge and understanding of how individuals develop culturally informed selves, what processes may be operating in terms of what people narrate, and how they do this, which is different depending on the cultures that they come from. The study paves a way for using Greimas's narrative structure to investigate further how culture and self co-construct. Now, future studies can further explore the basic human cognitive, behavioral, and memory processes that operate cross-culturally, which is captured in each of our narrative structure. Thank you.